In this episode, we are stepping into domain one of the Certified Information Systems Auditor, CISA, certification, and that matters because this domain gives you the basic rhythm of how information systems auditing actually works from start to finish. For a brand new learner, the phrase information systems auditing process can sound a little formal or even a little distant, but the idea behind it is practical and very human. Organizations rely on systems to run payroll, protect customer data, process transactions, manage operations, and support decisions. So someone has to examine whether those systems and the controls around them are working the way they should. That is what this domain begins to teach. It explains how an auditor approaches an environment, how audit work is planned, how evidence is gathered, how conclusions are formed, and how findings are communicated in a way that leadership can actually use. If you understand this domain well, the rest of the certification starts to feel more connected because you can see that auditing is not a random collection of checks. It is a disciplined process for building confidence through evidence, professional judgment, and clear communication. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyberauthor.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. At its core, an information systems audit is a structured review of systems, processes, and controls to determine whether they are protecting the organization, supporting its objectives, and operating in a reliable way. This is important to understand early because many beginners assume auditing is just another word for security testing or technical troubleshooting, and that is too narrow. An auditor is not mainly trying to fix systems directly, and the auditor is not there to run the business process on behalf of management. The auditor is there to examine whether important activities are designed well, carried out properly, and supported by enough evidence to justify confidence. That means the work can include access controls, change management, system operations, backup processes, development practices, vendor oversight, and many other areas where technology and business risk meet. The process is careful rather than dramatic. Instead of chasing excitement, it focuses on whether responsibilities are clear, whether controls match the risk, and whether the organization can demonstrate that its systems deserve to be trusted. One reason this process matters so much is that organizations make claims every day, whether they say them out loud or not. They claim that only authorized users can reach sensitive information, that system changes are approved and tested, that critical services can be restored after disruption, and that important data is accurate enough to support decisions. Those claims affect customers, executives, regulators, partners, and internal teams, so they cannot be based only on confidence or habit. Auditing helps test whether those claims rest on solid ground. This makes the auditor's role less about suspicion and more about assurance. Good audit work helps leadership understand what is truly happening inside important systems instead of what they merely hope is happening. In that sense, the process serves the organization by reducing blind spots. When a system appears stable but key controls are weak, the audit process helps surface that gap before the weakness becomes a much bigger problem through fraud, outage, error, or loss of confidence. A major idea running through Domain 1 is that audit work should be risk-based. That phrase means an auditor does not treat every process, system, or weakness as equally important because time and attention are limited and not every issue carries the same business impact. A risk-based approach starts by asking what matters most to the organization, what could go wrong, and where weak controls could create meaningful damage. If one system supports financial reporting and another supports a low-impact internal convenience function, those environments may not deserve the same level of audit attention. The same logic applies within a process. A missing approval step on a critical change may deserve much more concern than a minor formatting problem in a supporting document. This way of thinking helps new learners understand why the audit process begins with context rather than with testing for its own sake. The auditor needs to know what the organization is trying to protect, what failures would matter most, and how risk should shape the scope and depth of the work. Planning is where that risk-based mindset becomes visible. Before evidence is collected or testing begins, the auditor must understand the business area under review, the systems involved, the purpose of the audit, and the conditions that make the work meaningful. Planning is not busy work at the front of the engagement. It is the stage where the auditor decides what is being reviewed, why it is being reviewed, and what success would look like for the engagement itself. This usually includes identifying objectives, learning the process at a high level, considering prior findings, recognizing major risks, and thinking about where the strongest sources of evidence are likely to be found. Good planning creates clarity for everyone involved. Without it, audit work can become too broad, too shallow, or too reactive. A new learner should think of planning as the difference between examining a process with purpose and simply wandering through an environment collecting facts that may or may not support a useful conclusion. Strong planning gives the audit direction, boundaries, and relevance. Closely related to planning is the idea of scope, which defines the boundaries of the engagement. Scope matters because an audit cannot responsibly examine everything at once, and a vague scope often leads to vague results. If an auditor is reviewing user access, the scope may focus on one business application, one time period, one department, or one part of the access process such as approvals, provisioning, or review of existing access. If the scope becomes too wide, the audit may struggle to go deep enough to produce meaningful insight. If it becomes too narrow, it may miss the areas where risk is actually concentrated. Scope also connects to the criteria against which the process is being evaluated. The auditor needs a basis for judgment, which may come from internal policy, management expectations, legal obligations, industry practices, or documented standards. Once scope and criteria are clear, the audit process becomes much more disciplined. The auditor can then ask focused questions, collect relevant evidence, and avoid drifting into issues that are interesting but not central to the purpose of the engagement. After planning and scoping, the process moves into fieldwork, which is the part many people first picture when they think about auditing. Fieldwork is where the auditor gathers information, tests controls, analyzes evidence, and compares observed practice to expected practice. Even here, though, the work is not just a matter of collecting large amounts of data. The real challenge is collecting the right evidence and interpreting it responsibly. An auditor may review documents, interview process owners, observe activities, inspect system outputs, or compare a set of transactions against approval records. Each of those steps is meant to answer a specific question about whether a control exists, whether it is working, and whether the process as a whole is supporting the organization's objectives. The strongest fieldwork is purposeful and connected to the audit objectives established earlier. A beginner should remember that fieldwork is not random inspection. It is guided investigation. The auditor is following a logic that connects risk, control, evidence, and conclusion in a way that can later be explained and defended. Evidence sits at the center of the entire auditing process because conclusions without support are only opinions. Domain 1 keeps returning to this idea because audit work gains value only when the auditor can show why a conclusion was reached and what information supports it. Evidence can take many forms, including policy documents, approval records, access listings, system-generated reports, screenshots, configuration outputs, interview responses, observation of a live process, or records from prior monitoring activity. What matters is not just the existence of evidence, but its quality. Strong evidence should be relevant to the objective, reliable enough to trust, and sufficient to support the conclusion being made. One document alone may not be enough if it only shows intent rather than actual performance. In many cases, the auditor needs more than one kind of evidence to build a solid picture. This is why testing matters. The auditor may inspect a sample of transactions, compare a process to written policy, or verify whether a control operated consistently over time. Evidence turns the audit from conversation into proof. Controls are another foundational idea in this domain, because the auditing process is often centered on whether controls are appropriate and effective. A control is simply something that helps reduce risk, guide behavior, or detect when something is wrong. Controls can be technical, administrative, manual, automated, preventive, detective, or corrective, but the main question for the auditor is whether they actually support the business objective they are supposed to protect. It is also important to distinguish between control design and control operation. A well-designed control may exist on paper and still fail in practice if people bypass it, misunderstand it, or perform it inconsistently. On the other hand, a team may be working hard in a process that feels effective day to day, but if the control design is weak, the organization may still face serious exposure. This distinction is crucial for beginners. The audit process is not satisfied with the mere presence of a rule or a documented step. It asks whether the control is sensible for the risk, whether it is being performed, and whether the evidence shows it is working over time. Professional judgment plays a major role throughout the process because auditing is not mechanical. Two issues may both be real, yet one may deserve much more attention because it affects a critical system, touches sensitive data, or creates a broader chance of business disruption. The auditor must decide what matters most, what evidence is persuasive, what follow-up questions are necessary, and how to describe risk in a fair and useful way. This is where concepts such as significance and materiality start to matter, even at a high level. Not every weakness deserves the same urgency, and not every exception changes the meaning of the overall process. A mature audit process does not exaggerate small issues simply to sound serious, and it does not dismiss important issues just because the process usually works most of the time. Good judgment helps the auditor avoid both extremes. It supports balanced conclusions that leadership can trust because they are neither alarmist nor careless. For new learners, this is a reminder that domain knowledge matters, but so does the ability to weigh evidence and understand business impact. Another piece of domain one that beginners should not overlook is documentation. Audit documentation is the record of what was planned, what was performed, what evidence was reviewed, and how the auditor reached the final conclusion. Some people think of documentation as a dull administrative task, but it is actually one of the strongest protections for audit quality. Without documentation, the work becomes harder to review, harder to validate, and harder to defend if anyone later asks how a conclusion was formed. Good documentation creates transparency inside the engagement. It helps another qualified person understand what the auditor did, what was found, and whether the conclusion is supported by the work. It also supports consistency across audit teams and across time. If an issue appears again in a future engagement, strong work papers can help show what was tested before and what changed since then. In that way, documentation is not just record keeping. It is part of the evidence trail, part of quality control, and part of what makes the audit process durable beyond one person's memory. Communication runs through the entire auditing process, not just the final report. From the beginning, the auditor needs to communicate the purpose of the engagement, coordinate with process owners, clarify questions, and make sure information is being understood in context. During fieldwork, communication helps the auditor confirm whether a perceived issue is real, whether there is additional evidence available, and whether a control works differently in practice than it first appeared on paper. This does not mean the auditor becomes an advocate for the area under review, but it does mean the process works better when communication is clear, respectful, and grounded in facts. Good auditors ask questions without sounding hostile and explain observations without sounding vague. They also listen carefully, because a process owner may provide information that changes how a control should be understood. Communication matters even more because the final audience may include leaders who are not deep technical specialists. If the auditor cannot explain the issue in a way that connects to risk, responsibility, and business consequence, even accurate findings may fail to drive useful action. The reporting stage is where all the earlier work becomes visible. After planning, fieldwork, evidence gathering, testing, judgment, and documentation, the auditor needs to explain what was found and why it matters. A useful finding is usually more than a statement that something was wrong. It describes the condition observed, the expectation or criteria that was not met, the risk created by the gap, and the practical significance of that weakness for the organization. Reports should be clear enough that management can understand what needs attention and why. They should also be fair. If the language is overly dramatic, leadership may lose trust in the report. If it is too soft or vague, meaningful risk may be ignored. Many engagements also include management responses, action plans, or agreed follow-up steps, so the report does not simply identify problems and then disappear into a file. For a beginner, this is a useful reminder that the goal of the process is not to produce paperwork for its own sake. It is to produce understanding that can support better decisions and better control. One last idea that belongs in any overview of Domain 1 is follow-up, because auditing is not complete just because a report has been issued. If an important issue was identified and management agreed to corrective action, the organization eventually needs to know whether that action actually happened and whether it solved the problem. Follow-up supports accountability by reconnecting findings to real outcomes. This part of the process also reflects the ethical side of auditing. The auditor is expected to be objective, careful, and responsible with information, while management is expected to address risk in a serious way rather than treating findings as temporary inconveniences. That relationship works best when the process is grounded in integrity. Independence, confidentiality, professional care, and honesty are not decorations around the process. They are part of what gives the process value. Without them, even technically accurate work can lose credibility. Domain 1, therefore, teaches more than a sequence of steps. It teaches a professional way of examining systems so that the organization can rely on the conclusions being presented. As we close this overview, the most important thing to carry forward is that Domain 1 introduces auditing as a complete process rather than as a single act of inspection. The process begins with understanding the environment and the risk, continues through planning, scoping, evidence gathering, testing, documentation, judgment, communication, reporting, and follow-up, and depends at every stage on discipline and clarity. For someone new to the field, that is powerful because it turns auditing from a vague idea into a repeatable professional practice. It also helps explain why this domain sits at the front of the CISA journey. Before you can master detailed topics in governance, development, operations, or protection of assets, you need to understand how an auditor approaches those areas in the first place. Once that foundation is in place, the later material becomes easier to organize in your mind because you can see how each topic eventually becomes part of an engagement that is planned carefully, examined thoughtfully, and communicated in a way that helps the organization know what it can trust and what still needs work.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.